Okay, we've hit our official start time. So today my plan is to talk a little bit about market power and its, I guess, purest form, manifest, which is monopoly. We'll get to that. Of course, we have the usual things to discuss. There's 3 chapters, I guess, that kind of support this lecture in the readings. I guess to remind you, or to weave this into our general bookkeeping, I'm still kind of targeting the very beginning of November for our next exam. It's getting close, right? We're getting close to within 2 or so weeks of that, and I'd like to give you at least 2 weeks' notice. So the thought is, you know what? Next time we'll I say it here, we'll hopefully decide exactly what day we'll have it, and then we'll have our schedules fixed. We can start in with the usual practice exam materials and going over the practice exam, all that stuff. I did post another homework, so now there's 6, 7, 8, the 3 homeworks there. And after today, that should be, you should be able to do all 3 of those without too much problem. Okay. Last time, we talked a little bit about, or we talked a lot about, I guess, the so-called perfectly competitive model of an industry, right? We saw all of its graphical, pieces, sort of how they all fit together. And there's really kind of a lot of moving parts, and it's really quite a marvelous model for just thinking about, if you're ever going to start thinking about a problem, it's a great place to start. And in fact, I say here in my last bullet point, this is our benchmark, right? The very first thing you should think about when you sort of think about an industry is, okay, what would a competitive industry look like? And then what am I actually looking at? And we're going to kind of begin that thought experiment today. So just to review the pieces here, over here on the right-hand side, we have our firm. Here I have 3 different prices. Suppose the price is P1. Our firm reacts to this price of P1 by producing Q1, right? Price equal marginal cost, right? Which is like price equal to marginal revenue, additional revenue in this particular case, right? The firm just sees this price and reacts to it. And of course, we saw that last time we could deduce how well the firm was doing at this by looking at, we go down to average cost, and then we look at the marginal cost, average cost rectangle, and that gives us profits, right? Of course, coinciding with all of our firms out there doing this, there is a supply curve. It's just labeled S, say, to start with. That's all the firms in the industry making decisions as they are on the right-hand side. As price goes up and down, we'll trace out this supply curve. And you can even think about this as being the short-run situation of an industry. This movement up and down a given supply curve based on what all the individual firms are doing, right? Okay, and so we also added to this last time a little bit of normative analysis. That is to say, we started to think about this from the perspective of society. Is our competitive market doing something that's good from the perspective of society? Insofar as we developed this whole machinery previously in the semester, this consumer surplus, producer surplus machinery, the answer will be yes, right? That's simply because supply and demand are intersecting at this point. And of course, you might think about this as being a little bit more loaded with this idea that, when price and quantity, my labeling's a little off down here. When price and quantity are equal, we have this situation where the marginal benefits of the last unit produced, right, equal the marginal costs of the last unit produced industry-wide. That's good, right? We've seen that what we try to do is, increase when marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost and decrease when marginal benefit is less than marginal cost. So the market is kind of finding that point automatically, right? By virtue of consumers behaving rationally, right? Buying when the price is less than their benefits, marginal benefits, and all of our individual suppliers here are also behaving rationally, right? What they're doing is they're producing when the marginal cost is less than the price. You put those things together and you get this good result from the perspective of society. You can understand it as I just described it intuitively. You can also understand it as making those producer and consumer surpluses as large as possible, right? In sum. That's good. So in that perspective, it was a good outcome. Last time we talked about our economic understanding of time, right? This distinction between short and long run periods of decision making. And the way we broke this down was we said in the short run, well, firms are doing the stuff I just described here. Price equal marginal cost. That's how we decide what to produce. It's kind of the day-to-day, as I keep saying, operations. It doesn't, you know what I mean, though. It doesn't have to be day-to-day. It just depends upon that time frame in which you can tune your operation to the vicissitudes, I'll say, of the market, right, as it moves around through time. Right. Well, in the long run, you can think about, the bigger decision being whether or not you want to be in the industry at all, right? Do I want to get involved in this industry? Do I want to leave the industry, right? And that's where this notion of a shifting supply curve comes in, and where you can kind of think about our rectangles here. So maybe I can point to this one here. The way I started out drawing things, we have this curve here. So the market price is here, and we wind up with a profit margin, right? A profit margin, which is this distance, right? The distance between price and average costs. There's a rectangle there. We described this, or we understood this rectangle as an incentive for other firms to enter the industry, right? Our maple syrup industry from last time. Well, when that happens, the number of firms change, and when the number of firms change, that changes market supply. Shifts out, price falls down to 2, and now each individual firm is reacting to that P2 there by producing Q2. We can repeat that whole analysis again and say, well, there's still profits there. There'll be further entry, right? The profit margin here is like that. So this will precipitate further entry. Firms enter, the supply curve shifts out again, and maybe we're down to this point here. And we described this last point. I kind of miss it a little bit on my graph here. This last point is this point at where price is equal to marginal cost equals the minimum of average cost. Right? No more profits. No more incentive for anybody to enter or leave the industry, right? Everybody's making a breaking even. What we mean by that is every resource used by this firm is being compensated fairly. There's no incentive for anyone to leave or enter, and that would be our long-run equilibrium of the industry. And from the perspective of society, this is even better, right? Why is that the case? Well, everything I said about the short run, right? Indeed, with every long-run equilibrium, there's also a short-run equilibrium, right? Everything is true in the long run, that's true in the short run, but now we add to it this minimum average cost, right? This minimum average cost result, which means that whatever it is we're producing, not only are we getting the marginal benefits and the maximal marginal benefits plus marginal costs out of all of this, producer and consumer surplus, we're also getting firms to produce as efficiently as they possibly can at the minimum average cost. So all of this together kind of makes for a nice short and long run result from the perspective of society. And so going forward, I think I started by saying this, and maybe I'll wrap up my discussion of this slide by saying it again. This is our benchmark, right? Both when we talk about, well, ideally, what is an industry, how does it operate, right? Both in the short run and over time. And that's just a description of an industry, but it's also our benchmark from the perspective of societal welfare. We say, well, a competitive industry is about the best case scenario, right? If we're analyzing some other situation, something we'll start to do today, how does it depart from the competitive outcome, right? How and why does it depart from this competitive outcome? And then what we can do is we can start thinking about policy, right? We can start saying, okay, well, it doesn't look like, I'll have an example from Kodak in subsequent classes. Most people probably don't even know what Kodak is these days. How many people have heard of Kodak? Okay, most people do know what Kodak is, right? Maybe we'll talk a little bit about Google. I'll talk about some big box department stores, all of these things. They don't exactly fit our competitive situation, which I'll be talking about in a second. And we have to sort of begin by asking, how do they differ? And then how do we change things based on that, right? But we start here with our benchmark. So it is worthwhile, though, or perhaps equally important, not just to understand the graphical mechanics of what we just described. I know I kind of went through that quickly, by the way, but hopefully you can go back and look at the last video if you're so inclined to see some of the details. We worked a couple of those. It's important to remember the assumptions we had to make before we started drawing all those graphs, right? So we had to start off by, and maybe I'll leave the first one, I should have put that lower on the list, because freedom of entry and exit kind of makes our industry tick in the long run. In the short run, we said that we're going to imagine that there's many small firms in our industry, right? A lot of small firms. Remember Dave's maple syrup in the maple syrup industry? Dave was producing 10 units, and the market had hundreds of thousands of units trading. That's kind of what we mean. Why do we do that? Well, that ensures that everybody is too small relative to the market to influence it, right? So you see a price and you react to it. That's what you do if you're a firm. And in fact, these other assumptions, for example, the homogeneous product, however you want to pronounce it, kind of buttresses this, right? It makes it so that that's really the firm's only decision, at least in the short run. What is the price determined in the big market? How do I react to it? And we have a very nice, clean graphical description of how that works, right? So we've made assumptions that effectively ensure that this is how our industry will operate. Homogeneous products, small firms. Oftentimes I've hedged my, I haven't quite said this. Perfect information you usually assume as well. I've kind of posed this as, things like product positioning and advertising aren't necessary. That is to say, everybody knows who produces what, right? Where they can get it, all of that stuff. You're not worried about any of those things. By the way, information is a complicated and relatively recent preoccupation in economics, and we actually have classes on economics of information, and you get into all these interesting things: contracting behavior, monitoring, all of incentives, all of these interesting issues. Anyways, so those assumptions there, the second and third points, make the firm just reactive to the market price. The first one is what makes our long run industry, our long run tick, right? Freedom of entry and exit. It's the fact that you see rectangles and then profit rectangles and decide to enter. That drives us. This competition drives the market towards the minimum of average cost. And you might also think of this freedom of entry and exit as supporting this many small firms idea, right? The idea that anybody can jump in at any scale and start producing. But it's really neat because it has this neat sort of, the loop is closed, I'll say, theoretically. So the whole of the market is the sum of its individual small constituent parts, right? Each firm, we add all those up and we make the market. At the same time, the parts react to the whole, right? Each individual firm is reacting to what the entire market is doing. It's a really sort of, it interlocks quite nicely in that way. Okay, so I laid out these assumptions and I'm describing all of this because our point of departure then, right, will become going forward. What happens when one of these assumptions breaks down, right? What if firms aren't producing a homogeneous product, right? Everybody's producing something a little different. What if there aren't many small firms, right? What if we have one giant firm? That's kind of what we're going to start with today, right? It turns out that those, at least from an analytical perspective, both of those things that I just mentioned give us our first point of departure was that someone, right, small firm, big firm, whatever, gets market power as a result of this, right? And so what we do going forward, or what we'll do today, is we'll first develop this notion of, well, what do I mean when I say someone has market power? We talked a bit about this last time. I'll revisit a little bit of that example, and I have a more complete one that starts to introduce what happens to our supply and demand machinery again, right? So that's where we're headed here. So as a practical matter, what happens? It's pretty simple. Right? Firms, you could say it this way, firms perceive that the demand for their product is downward sloping, right? So firms, when they have market power, know that they're not just producing for this big bad market. They know that when they slide their quantities up and down, well, they're going to get different prices. Or they're, put another way, they're going to have to sell their product at different prices, right? I can't decide to just sell a lot of units at a high price, right? If I want to sell a lot of units, I'll need a lower price. So firms understand this, right? And I do say, so everybody thinks, you can often think about this as now firms are choosing price and quantity. That's not exactly right. There's still kind of one decision, right? It's more about where do I produce on my demand curve, right? So when I pick a quantity, that will determine a price. Right? If I want a high price, well, that's going to drive the quantity I can sell, right? So it's still one decision, but it's just a little bit more nuanced. And we're going to ask, how does this change everything, right? How does this change mechanically just where we find the equilibrium in a market? That's what I mean by positive analysis, right? What do we predict happens in these circumstances? Okay, well, once we understand how the industry behaves in these circumstances, next we have to ask, well, is the outcome good or bad for society, right? And we can think about that as our normative analysis. Luckily, we're pretty adept at doing the two things now, right? We've talked about how to find equilibria, right? How firms make decisions. They're profit maximizing, rational decision makers, right? And then we can say, well, what happens from the perspective of society? We have our surplus machinery available for that, right? So it should be fun. And we're going to do this for a couple of different cases. I get increasingly excited at this point in class because, not only do we get to do Monopoly, but we get to do, as I'll say in a couple slides, some other interesting cases as well. But just backing up for a minute, a lot of what Adam Smith said, right, back in The Wealth of Nations, was sort of, I don't want to say anti-monopoly, but he was among the first to point out that monopoly was a problem, right? And he pointed out that what happens, or what could happen in a monopoly situation, is that the price could be too high, right, and quantity too low, relative to what was natural in some sense. That, roughly speaking, that's how he put it. And so we're going to try to understand this, and this thing that Adam Smith was among the first to identify. It's also, in some ways, a big and ongoing policy issue, in that recently in the big economics journals, there's a lot of stuff on markups and market power. I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of time to talk about that aspect of monopoly as well. And people are starting to say, well, maybe this is a problem, that firms have this market power to determine prices on one side of the equation, and then they also have, in many instances, market power to determine wages on the other side, right? And so this is an interesting debate that filters into this ongoing discussion in economics about inequality and macroeconomic performance and all of that stuff. So, and what we're about to say is the basic theory that economists use to attack this problem. Okay. So over the next couple classes, here's the roadmap. After we understand how market power works, we'll look at this traditional theory of monopoly, right? And you might think these are the traditional monopolists that my usual suspects that I talk about. The power company, the cable company. Though the cable company is kind of morphed into an internet service provider company, because my kids don't watch cable television at all. Channel surfing, stuff like that. They don't know anything about that. U.S. Steel, Kodak, which I mentioned, film producer, Microsoft. Microsoft is starting to morph into something different than what we're understanding here. Now you typically probably think about the big monopolists as Google and Facebook and Amazon and companies like that. Even now it makes me a little uncomfortable about this, because I'm not sure, maybe you feel differently, I'm not sure how well that stuff fits the model that we're about to talk about. Something different going on there. One thing I will add on to all of this is a little side discussion of retail monopolies, right? So what do I mean by that? I mean firms like Costco, right? BJ's, stuff like that. But I'm going to, use this as a way of, parlaying things into a discussion of economic growth and entrepreneurship, which in some ways you can think of as a search for monopoly. I should have added the word temporary here. A search for monopoly power, right, is kind of, if you're an entrepreneur, that's something that you want to do, and hopefully you'll understand why you want to acquire a monopoly if you can, if you're an entrepreneur. And maybe you'll also understand why some monopolies, if not all, are temporary beasts, right? There's a reason why, for example, when I throw it out there and I ask who knows anything about Kodak, which was an enormous monopoly that existed for, a long period of time. Well, what happened to Kodak, right? Interesting question. Okay. So, I don't know if we need to, this slide is maybe a little redundant with the last one. But we can do everything we need to, more or less, with supply and demand curves, right? Some of the firms that will, maybe this is the way I'll throw this slide out there. We're going to not just talk about competition and monopoly. Those are two polar cases, right? There's some stuff in between that's perhaps even more interesting. Oligopoly, right? That's where we have a couple of small firms. And this is a nice gateway into thinking about strategic behavior and the world of game theory, which I love to talk about. That's probably why I put this slide up here, just so I could mention it, right? And then we'll think about that stuff as well, right? Once again, starting from this competitive benchmark. Okay, so coming back down to planet Earth here and reintroducing our analytics. You'll remember last time we talked a little bit about the Baker's economics lessons. Once again, another example where we start off with a seemingly mundane specific case, right? But then as we develop this, we uncover some general principles. So I had this 180-60 scenario where I sell at a price of 100, I sell one economics lesson. 2 at 80, 3 at 60, that's just my demand curve, right? A numerical statement of the demand curve for my services, right? I added in this costs where each lesson that I provide costs me $50, a constant cost structure. More on that in a lecture or two. And then we looked at this and we said, well, what should I do? Well, really what I was trying to do was set up this comparison, even in this very simple example, what I would do when the market is approximately, I guess, competitive, versus what I would do when I perceive that I have market power. That is to say, I understand my price up here. So in a situation where there's a given price, so you might think about this as, there's all these people out there offering economics lessons, in my building, in my neighborhood, whatever, they're all about the same, whether you take it from Baker or, Joe Sixpack or whoever, and they go for about $60, right? Well, if that's the case, if I just face this going price of 60, that's what the market gives me, as in my competitive diagrams, all I do is look at that and react to it, right? I say, well, let's see, my costs are 50, I get 60. I should supply a lesson. That's my first lesson. My second one, the price doesn't change, right? I'll do the same. 1, 2, 3 lessons I should supply because the price is greater than my marginal costs. Fair enough, right? We saw that something different happened when I produced this exclusive good Baker's economics lessons. Nobody quite liked Baker, right? So when that happens, we did something different. And the logic was simple. I can work you through it here. For $100, if I supply one lesson, right? Put another way, if I put $100 and I know one person will show up at my door, I know I'll make 100 minus 50, which is what it costs me to supply that one lesson, right? Why not 2 lessons at 100? Because there's no demand for 2 lessons at 100, right? I understand this. One lesson, 100, costs of 50, I make $50 effectively. If I drop my price, right, drop it down to 80, well, let's see, I know I'll get 2 customers. 80 times 2 is 160. My costs are 50 plus 50, 100. 160 minus 100 is $60. Oh, okay, I make more money. I should do that. I should lower my price to 80, produce 2 lessons, and then make $60. Well, I might even think 3. Let's see, 3 times 60, 180. $180 coming in, $180 coming in. Well, let's see, 50, 50, 50, 150 is my cost. Now I'm only making 30. So by producing and selling that third lesson, or I should say by producing and doing what I have to the price to sell that third lesson, I'm actually losing money, right? 30 is less than 60. So I should do what I say here, stop at 2, right? The big lesson of this little thought experiment is that when I determine my price, or put another way, when I think about what price I have to set to sell the lessons I'm producing, I behave differently than when there is a market price, right? So really our big task is just understanding why this is the case. Once we have that in place, right, we can then see how our market is going to work, or how all of those big. So who thought you could think about 3 economics lessons on Saturday morning provided by Baker and understand something about U.S. Steel, Kodak, and Microsoft? Well, let's figure it out here. So this is kind of what I said here. Oh, one last thing. In the first just to remind you, first I'm reacting to the price. Second, I'm determining it along with my quantity. One little wrinkle that I'm hoping we'll have some time to think about is, what if I don't have to make my price public, right? What if I can say, need economics lessons on the thing I nail to the telephone pole with the little phone number tags to tear off? What if I can nail that up there and say, need economics lessons? For price, inquire within. Right? That's called price discrimination and gives us yet another interesting thing to think about. Okay, so the key idea here is realizing now that marginal revenue is a little bit more complicated than just the price. Right? Remember before in the competitive setting, whenever I produce an additional, maple syrup unit, or I produce an additional economics lesson, in a competitive world, I'm just getting the price back, right? Every additional unit I sell is at the going market price. Well, now when we sort of move to this situation where I have market power, that's no longer the case, right? Now every time I produce more, the price goes down. So that will change marginal revenue, and generically what happens is marginal revenue is something less than price, right? I'll show you why in a second. And that's typically the case with market power. And there's a simple logical reason for this, right? By lowering the market price and selling one more unit, a monopolist or whoever we're talking about with market power doesn't get back the entire price and revenue, right? There's a simple algebraic or arithmetical way to understand this. So I have an example here, a visit to I think we're going to go through in rapid succession, the local barber / hairstylist, right, and their pricing decisions. And then we're going to return to Baker's grilled cheese operation, right? And we'll sort of flesh these things out in those examples. And then we'll look at, the Kodaks and Microsofts and firms like that of the world, right? So anyway, here we go. Let's think about your local hair salon, right? And maybe we're talking about haircuts sold per hour. So it works exactly as you. By the way, how do I pick these examples? Mainly because I try to get the prices to seem reasonable, right? Something that'll look reasonable to you. There's been inflation, right, over the X amount of years since I've been doing this. So maybe these are a little bit low for haircut prices. I'm going to have to revise all this up. And, of course, we'll talk about inflation later in the semester. Anyway, so here are the prices. You can imagine how this works. You slap a price schedule out there on the sandwich board outside of your shop, and you can observe the following if you're the hairdresser, barber, whatever, over time. If you put a price of 20 out there, nobody comes in your shop over the hour. If you lower the price to $18 for a haircut, one person comes in. If you lower it to 16, 2 people come in. So hopefully you can kind of see that this is a demand curve. Prices and quantities, right? The hourly demand for haircuts. And so what we want to understand first is how your revenue changes as you change the price, right? How does your revenue change as you alter this price given this demand curve, right? And so here I have an example there where we're talking about what happens to this business when we move from point C to point D. That is to say, when we lower the price from $16 a haircut to $14. Well, mechanically, we've done this the whole semester. You see what happens. The first thing that happens when the price goes down is quantity demanded increases by 1 unit here, right? Get an additional haircut every hour. Okay, the price is down. And so if you want to think about one aspect to this decision, one thing that happens is you've now lost $2 for those haircuts you were giving. Right? When you're giving 2 haircuts, they were $16. When you go to 3, you've kind of had to lower the price of all those previous haircuts, right, that you used to sell at $16. So you've shaved $2 off of each haircut you're offering, right? And in some sense, that's that red rectangle. That's kind of a loss that you incur when you lower your price, right? But the news isn't all bad. You gain an additional unit in sales, right? So when you go from 2 to 3, you sell an additional haircut. So you can think about this as kind of being marginal revenue as being the composition of these two things, right? When you lower the price, you lose money because your units are selling for less, right? But you gain something because you're now selling more units, right? Often, I guess the red rectangle is kind of harder to see, which is why I described it first, right? That when you lower price and sell more, everything is selling more cheaply. That's the red rectangle. But you're selling more. So you want to think of marginal revenue as the sum, or I guess you could say as the difference between the blue and the red rectangle. Mechanically, what that would mean is that, well, let's see, this blue rectangle has an area of 14. That's the additional unit we're selling, right? 14. Well, what is the red rectangle? Well, it's $2 off of 2 haircuts, so that's 4, right? So 14 minus 4 is 10. Our marginal revenue would be 10. Now you can kind of continue in that fashion, or you can do what I did last time, which is or what I did in the couple slides ago when I was talking about lessons. You can just multiply it out, right? Look at total revenue, and then see how it changes as you increase units, right? So you just do price times quantity, right? For each possible price quantity pair, you get a total revenue, and then just look at the change in total revenue. And then you get, in some ways this is better because you get the change sort of puts your marginal revenues in between units as they should be, right? Marginal concepts apply from 2 to 3, not at 2 or at 3. So this is kind of one of the problems with some of the graphs I do a little bit later. But you can see what happens then. What I've done now is I have 20 and 18, kind of halfway in between here, right? I have halfway in between 1 and 2, I have 14. Halfway between 2 and 3, I have 10. I've plotted out all of these marginal revenues, right? And hopefully you can see, the geometry that's emerging on this picture. That we're getting a marginal revenue curve, right? A marginal revenue curve that lies below the demand curve, right? What does that mean? Well, this is the way we would geometrically capture this idea that marginal revenue is less than price, right? The additional revenue we earn from selling an additional unit is less than the price because there's because of those red and blue rectangles. And indeed, marginal revenue almost always lies below price. So, all right, so now we've described hopefully you're with me here. Now we've described mechanically how marginal revenue works, right? We can sort of back up a little bit and we can say, well, what does this mean for decision making? Luckily, we already kind of know that firms maximize profits by finding the point where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, right? Or by comparing marginal revenue and marginal cost. So I thought, at the risk of belaboring the whole idea here, I thought I would kind of show you this in some detail. and I'll go back to my grilled cheese operation. Before we just had grilled cheese last time, right? We talked about grilled cheese selling, and all I did was sort of take the going price and I reacted to it. Well, maybe now I've developed a gourmet grilled cheese that sits in a very, great location on a Manhattan sidewalk, high demand. It's a unique product I have, right? If only because of my location and because of my, the way I make the grilled cheese. Maybe I have some tomato soup, coffee, who knows, right? So anyways, I have some market power in this problem, and I realize that I have a demand curve. And if I always try to get my units to make sense. In this case, I don't know how you might think about this as 100, a unit as 100 grilled cheeses or something like that in a day, if you like to do those things. But anyways, what should I do then if I face this demand curve for grilled cheese? And of course, to really answer this question, what we should do is think about not only what my prices are, my quantities are, but also what my costs are, right? And of course, my cost structure will depend upon whatever equipment I'm using, how many people I'm paying, all of that stuff. But anyways, let's look at this. My spreadsheet, okay, there it is. So I've added in some numbers, and here you go with the very simple calculation where I have quantity sold and price, right? That's the demand curve I was just describing. That's what this is, a demand schedule. And here I've just calculated out total revenue exactly as I did on my previous slides, right? Just multiplying quantities and prices. It's interesting, you can see that it has, if you don't have to look at this that hard to see that it kind of has a hill shape, right? Which is interesting in and of itself. It suggests that even if I just care about pricing, I'm going to hit a point where my prices, my revenues top off and then they start going down. Meaning even if I'm just trying to sell grilled cheeses, I can put the price too low. I can lose money by setting the price too low. So if I plot this out, let me see here, there it is. This is a plot of my revenues. I have a cost curve, you can ignore that for the time being. Suffice it to say though, eventually what you're going to try to do is find the point where revenues and costs are as far apart as possible. Right, that's maximum profits. But the revenues, just focus on the blue here. The revenues are just they go like this. So, right, this implies that if I were to maximize revenues, not even worrying about costs, right, I would probably want to find a quantity around 5, right? And of course, if I pick that quantity, well, then I can just sort of say, mechanically, what is the price? So that would suggest the quantity should be here. I should sell 5 units at a price of 5, and that would give me maximal total revenue here. Just the revenue side of things. I haven't even thought about costs. You can see here, however, that we have an interesting development in terms of marginal revenue. Marginal revenue here is just the change as we go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, as we know, right? You can see that what happens at this 5th unit is my marginal revenue actually becomes negative, right? That means by lowering price and selling an additional unit, I'm actually losing money, right? So where is that? If you go to this slide, and you sort of continue, thinking about what these red and blue rectangles look like, at some point, my red rectangle is going to be really big and my blue rectangle is going to be really small. Well, in my grilled cheese example anyways, what we found is that this occurs right around 5, where the blue overwhelms the red, right? So selling an additional unit does not motivate, support, I'll say, lowering price. We're losing money by doing so. So what we could do is we could graph, here I've graphed this marginal revenue and this demand, and you can see here that right around this point 5, marginal revenue slides below 0, which would correspond to the top of that hill. Now I know, yes?
Is that true that marginal revenue is total revenue minus the next best option?
I would say that it's true that marginal revenue is total revenue for X units subtracted from total revenue from X plus 1 units, right? So it's the change in total revenue.
Okay.
Right.
But it's kind of the next best option. It's not always the next. At plus 1.
I'm going to give you, and I'm going to use your answer to answer a question that no one asked. But yeah, so you could say, I mean, it is a curve in the sense that you can say that, well, marginal revenue tells me that this is my best option to maximize revenues, and as I move away from this, my revenues are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, if that's kind of what you're saying, or what you're asking. I will also say, though, I'm going to make a pitch once again here for, taking Eco 200 and Eco 300. If you are sitting in the audience today and are a big fan of calculus, I don't know how many people that is out there, but you can see here that all marginal revenue is the slope of total revenue. And in calculus, what you do is you learn how to find extreme points, right? And that's typically where the slope is 0. Right? That's where the hill flattens out. You know you're at the top of the hill when it's flat, right? And that's essentially what happens when we go past 5 units. So I know you probably don't want to hear about calculus. I like to mention these things because when I was in college, I was a terrible calculus student. Awful, right? It didn't help that I rarely went to class, right? So now, of course, this is one reason why I take attendance. Because it's just good to be there, even if you don't want to be, or you don't think you want to be. But anyways, so I was a terrible calculus student until I wound up being an economics major, and then I had to use calculus, as you will, in your Eco 300 class, and it suddenly just fell into place. I was like, I get it now. I understand why we're learning about curves and trying to find maxima and all of that stuff. To find the top of the revenue hill, right, as it were. Using, for whatever equation we want to write down to characterize it. Okay. Right, so that was kind of my way of answering a question no one asked. One thing we might also do is we can add in costs, right? So these costs are let me see what happens if I increase that. Okay, that looks a little bit better. So now I've added in this cost curve, and I've just said that every unit, this is kind of like my economics lessons, every unit has some constant marginal cost. So as I go from, and there's no fixed cost here, once again, simple. So I produce 1 unit, it costs me 2. I produce a second unit. That second unit, given I'm producing the first one, costs me 2. Total is 4. 4 plus 2 is 6. So that gives me the costs associated with each, right? With each unit here. So here we see my quantity sold is 2, the price is 8. There's my marginal revenue, my total cost is 4. And now, of course, what we want to do is we want to not just find the maximum revenue, we want to find maximum profits. And you can see right in my diagram here, this occurs where profits are 16, right? So what does that mean in terms of my graphs? Well, I'm sorry, profits are 16, the price is 6, and the quantity is 4. So I put the cursor right on this point. That looks like it's about here, and indeed, maybe you can get a feel for how this is the point at which the red line, the cost line, and the blue line are as far apart as they possibly can be, right? In fact, you can even think about it as tilting the hill this way, right? And then trying to find the maximum of the hill that way, right? And that's how we would maximize profit. So I wonder what will happen if I change my cost to 3. Well, it looks like the maximum is kind of at 3 or 4, right? And so you can kind of see, the lines, see this little segment here is kind of parallel to the red. Once again, it would be kind of, if we repositioned everything, that would be the top of the hill there. Well, how about one more? I just want to see what happens. 4, my costs go up by 4 every unit. Well, let's see. Profits of 9 are my maximum. Looks like I want this situation here. Okay. it's, obviously that, if we want to think about this as a quick and simple way of making decisions, this is a little complicated to look at hills and graphs and all that stuff. As luck would have it, there's a pretty easy way to make this comparison, and it is to rely on our old friends marginal revenue and marginal cost and just comparing them, right? So when marginal revenue, additional revenue generated from producing a unit, lowering the price a little, marginal revenue. When marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, produce the unit. When marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, reduce, right? Don't produce the unit. So if you kind of think about scaling production up and down based on that rule, in the end, you'll arrive at a position where marginal revenue and marginal cost should be about equal, right? Then you can't change anything to increase profits. And so in this last example here, where I have my marginal cost constant at 4, right? So it's just a flat line. You can see I've kind of put that into this picture here. So here's my flat marginal cost of 4 line. Boy, that works really nicely. Now, if you think about where my marginal revenue line is, well, it's the red line, right? So mechanically, what I'm trying to do is get as close to this point as I possibly can. It turns out in my example, the closest whole number to this, if I structured these things a little bit better, or if I was able to kind of shift the marginal value so it would be between 2 units and not just at 1 unit, that would fall right around 3, right? And then mechanically what I would do, I find where marginal revenue and marginal cost are about equal, and then I just sort of see what the price is, right? Read the price off my demand curve. So you can think about what I do then is I say, okay, well at 3 units, marginal revenue and marginal cost are about equal. I'll go up to my demand curve and pick the price off. It looks like it's 7, right? So that'll be the price I charge to go along with my quantity of 3, where marginal revenue and marginal cost are as close as they can be, right? So that's kind of what I'm doing. Now, I right before class, I said, well, it would be nice if I had an example where marginal costs increased. And so, so we get the standard curve where marginal costs are going up. You can see here I've made my example like this. That doesn't really change anything, but it looks more like a diagram you're used to. So for example, here's marginal costs, marginal revenue. This would seem to suggest that, let's see, where's the last unit where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost? Is it unit 4? Marginal revenue is 3, marginal cost is 1.8. If we produce that next unit, marginal revenue falls to 1, marginal costs are 2.1, so we're sort of in between, right? We have a curve that kind of, if I were to put my marginal curves here, you can see my marginal cost is like this. My marginal revenue is this red line. It looks like right around 4 they cross. So that would suggest I want a price of 6, right? And indeed, if you look at my profits, well, I missed it. They top out there. It's a little bit of a miss. So let me see if I can. Let's try this and see if I can just kind of mess around with this. This is my. Okay, so what if I change this to 1? Maybe we'll get it there. That's a little bit cleaner. So, right now you can see my marginal costs going up. My marginal revenue is here. Marginal revenue, marginal costs. Well, it's about at 4 again. Profits top out at 20, and you can kind of see, it doesn't quite line up the way you would like. You can kind of see that marginal revenue and marginal cost are crossing at this point, which suggests that I should have a price up there. So the same mechanics, right? And hopefully you can appreciate the intuition behind how it all works here. What's going on here? Good. Okay. So once again, there's the rule for posterity's sake. When you review the lecture and all that stuff, you have a very clean statement of how someone with market power, right, a producer with market power should produce. Find that marginal revenue equal marginal cost point. And you can see that, you can even think about this as a rule that you apply iteratively. So, for example, I start out with my grilled cheese operation. I say I'm going to produce 600 or 6 units a day. I realize that a price goes along with that. I look at my costs, my marginal costs from producing that last unit, and I look at the revenue that I'm making. I might say, well, I should pull back, right? I should pull back my production. Oh, or maybe I should increase it if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. When I find that sweet spot, I'm done. Okay. Now let's take this. We understand what a firm with market power does, but now let's build up an industry structure around it, right, and make it real, right? Make it into a real thing. And to do so, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to describe this. We'll get into some of the practicalities of monopoly and all that next time, but we're going to assume that a monopoly is an industry just that is characterized by only one person selling the product, right? Mono means one, right, in Greek, and so one seller, right? And of course, this is the canonical situation in which a firm has market power. There's nobody else who can sell this. Why this happens or how it happens, more on that next time. We'll just think about this situation where there's one seller. Well, in this case, this will mean that there's no distinction between the firm and the industry, right? The firm is the industry. So if you want to think about what this means as a practical matter, we're not drawing two graphs side by side anymore, right? There's one graph, the left-hand graph. Everything goes on that picture because the firm is the industry. Well, what would we expect to have happen here? Okay, well, it's really not all that different. All we have to do is remember that marginal cost and supply are the same, right? You've probably wondered why I've harped on this so much. Well, here it's really going to help us. Marginal cost and supply are the same. That gives us this curve here. Marginal revenue, of course, we saw lies below demand. So just in terms of working out the graphics, everything I said about grilled cheese applies here to my generic monopolist. Marginal revenue equal marginal cost is here. That's where we want to produce. And then we can find the price by going up to the demand curve, right? So to sum this up, we would say the monopolist will maximize its profits, some rational agent, right? Maximizing profits. Where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, the monopolist will produce this QM and will sell at that price PM, right? Okay? Fair enough. Now, if we're doing this thought experiment where we want just to compare monopoly and competition, what we want to do is, being good scientists, is we want to think about how we can just compare these two things without changing anything else, right? That's one of the problems that we face here, is that monopolies, once again for reasons we'll discuss in the future, they tend to look a lot different than competitive industries. But if we're just thinking what's wrong with the market structure or what's wrong with the situation, we want to think about a situation where we can flip a switch and imagine our industry goes from competitive to monopolist, and just think about how that changes things, independent of everything else. We know Microsoft is different than the oil industry, and Microsoft isn't selling wheat, right? We want to step aside and say something like, well, how would the world be different if the wheat industry were monopolized, right? And maybe that's the way to think about it. So think about my maple syrup example, where we had all those independent maple syrup producers. What if somehow they all were coordinated, right? Somebody had this idea that they were going to just coordinate the entire maple syrup industry. Put another way, I decide, say, I'm going to produce maple syrup, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around to each house, right, and I'm going to pay them the costs of production that they get for maple syrup. I will then take the maple syrup all to myself, right, and then sell it on the market. I'll choose the price and the quantities that everybody is producing in each of their backyards, right? I will do it all on my own. What am I trying to get at there? Well, I'm trying to say that the way maple syrup is produced is exactly the same. It hasn't changed, right? But the way the industry is organized and the way maple syrup is sold is now all under one umbrella, right? So I'm making all the decisions versus everybody making independent decisions is kind of what's happening. Nothing else is changing. Question?
Why is this considered short run?
Oh, why is this considered short run? Because, well, that's a good question. In the short run, I've said marginal cost is equal to supply, right? That should apply to the competitive industry as well as to the monopolist, as I just kind of, and maybe you've led me into explaining why I did that with maple syrup, right? Why I went through this whole thing where I'm saying there's nothing different about how maple syrup is produced. People make it in their backyards. I'm just taking charge of the whole thing and determining how much everybody's going to produce in each of their backyards and what the price is going to be, right? That hasn't changed the cost structure. So, a great leading question here. We can then say, as the monopolist, right, the maple syrup baron, Baker, will choose this point and sell maple syrup at that price. But we can then imagine what happens when I flick the switch. Baker disappears, and the industry becomes competitive. Well, now we're once again in the situation where everybody's making maple syrup in their backyards, and we arrive at the competitive situation, right, where the market, demand and supply determine price. Well, where does this lead us? That lets us see, right, that the market price should fall to PC, the competitive price, and QC should be produced, right? So all on the same diagram, right? This kind of answers your question. Notice supply is the same, right? Marginal costs are still the industry-wide marginal costs, right? That is to say, each point on this curve reflects the costs of someone out there producing maple syrup. In the monopoly setting, Baker, can sort of manipulate production so that the next unit comes from the cheapest possible producer, right? In the industry, that kind of happens automatically. But anyway, we can flick the switch. We can say, well, here's what would happen if everything were the same, but the industry were competitive. Here's what would happen if the industry were monopolized, right? And this is, of course, a short-run comparison because the supply curve is fixed in position. In the long run, it can change in a competitive industry, right, as people enter and exit. That's the key distinction. But this gives us all that we needed, all we really need to sort of think about this. I say here that profits are generated. That's hard. You can't really see that yet. That'll come when we talk about the long run. Right? So that's a little bit of a non sequitur where it's sitting here. But we can make all the other comparisons that we like to make. So this slide is here so you can reflect upon what I was saying about industry supply curves and individual supply curves. Right? When I'm a monopolist, right? In this case, we're back to bottled water. When I'm a monopolist, I just use this curve, right, to choose how I'm going to produce at all of these different prices. But that means that I can sort of work backwards and figure out, whether I should get prices water from Agua or Prima, if you want to go way back, ancient history in our class here. Okay, so there we go again. The good news is we can now look at these two things and we can say we have this sort of positive aspect to our model, right? We're explaining that this is how the monopolistic and competitive worlds compare, right? Monopoly has lower quantity and a higher price. The competitive firm has higher quantity and a lower price. Okay. Is that good or bad from the perspective of society? Well, you might say bad, might be your sort of gut reaction. But an economist might say, well, we don't know without recourse to some other methods. Why would that be the case? Well, monopolists are people too, right? The monopoly is owned by someone, and when it's doing well, right, when it's charging a high price and making profits, well, that's good for some people, right? In fact, this was the supposition back in the old mercantilist days, was that monopoly was good because, if you wanted, say, England to succeed in the international stage, you needed things like the British East India Company to project England overseas, a monopoly, right? Along with this went this idea that you needed to protect domestic industries from too much competition, right? That would enable them to produce and thrive. Well, we can actually look at that and say, well, that's not exactly true. Whatever it is the monopolist is earning, right, out of this does not offset what consumers are losing, right? The high price is good for that monopolist. The high price is bad for consumers. We can emphatically say that the bad for consumers part wins out here. How do we know this? Well, our old machinery, right? Our producer and consumer surplus machinery. So on the right here, this is the familiar picture. Ignore the marginal revenue curve. We see I don't know why I should pick colors that I can name here. It's like burnt orange and teal, right? Teal represents producer surplus in a competitive industry. The orange represents consumer surplus, right? Once again, below demand, above price is consumer surplus. Above supply, yet below price, producer surplus. Those are the surpluses. We add them together, and that would give us total societal welfare, right? As usual in our competitive market, our benchmark competitive market, right? Well, what happens when we go to a monopoly? Well, you see here we have marginal revenue and demand. The monopolist follows the rule as before, stops at this quantity, sets the price up there. Remember the mechanics there. And what does this leave the monopolist with? Well, the rules are still the same from calculating the surpluses. The blue area, the teal, is everything below the market price, determined by the monopolist, but above supply, right? That's the triangle and the square together, the trapezoid. Consumer surplus is the orange thing, right? Everything below demand but above price. And so you can see here that when we add the surpluses together, well, if we look at them individually, we get the result you might expect. The monopolist gains, or that the industry, the producer gains being a monopoly. Right? The blue there is bigger than the blue here. And how does the monopolist do it? Well, the monopolist keeps price high and quantity low at the same time, and then captures some of the consumer surplus, right? It's a good way of thinking about it. The monopolist restricts quantity and keeps price high to capture some of that orange rectangle area there, right? Here. In so doing, the monopolist destroys some of the surplus, right? What I mean by that is when we add blue and orange together in the monopoly world versus blue and orange in the competitive world, we see that the combined area is smaller here, right? So we've destroyed some surplus. What do we call that? A deadweight loss, right? Deadweight loss. The monopoly relative to our competitive benchmark results in deadweight loss, destruction of some of the gains from exchange, right? The monopolist does this to keep the price high. So that's kind of the classic story about why a monopoly, we think, is bad from the perspective of society. And in some ways it's a verification of this idea that competing interests gain and lose when we change things. In this case, when we keep everything the same and just flip a switch and change the industry from monopoly to competition, it's bad from the perspective of society. Right? Deadweight loss. Yes?
Yeah, according to this logic, the taxes or price ceilings are also bad.
Correct, yeah. And in some ways, you might think about this as in some ways, if you position things in a certain way, you can kind of think about this as mimicking the tax result, right? Where the monopolist chooses a tax on the product and then collects the revenue. Think about it that way. The monopolist, you could also think about it, settles on a price floor, right? Chooses a price floor for the product, and then winds up rationing, right, based and capturing all the results or all the returns to the rationing there, right? So there are parallels. I guess the easy way to say it is there are parallels between floors and taxes and all of that stuff. The big one is that they all create deadweight losses, and that's what I'm emphasizing here. So what we're going to do next time is we're going to think, the story doesn't end there, right? My indictment of monopoly does not end with just destruction of the surplus, deadweight loss, right? We'll also see that it does not do so well, it does not compare favorably to competition in the long run either, right? When we bring in the entry and exit machinery. So what we're going to do is we're also going to talk about, this is great because now we have a social problem, right? We have a situation where we observe monopolies out there in reality. What do we do as policymakers? It's a complex problem, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But even further down the road, I'm going to then argue that monopolies play a pretty critical role in both driving entrepreneurial behavior and also in pushing our economy forward because of the way these two things interact and the way this other factor, intellectual property, also works. So everybody's rustling around, and that's fine. That's fine. We're a little early, but it's okay. We'll call it a day here, and I will see you next time. No attendance today if you were curious. Okay, have a good weekend.